Welcome to Pete Hegseth News. Tonight we bring you a developing situation that has moved beyond speculation and into a zone of strategic uncertainty. What began quietly, without headlines or public acknowledgement, is now being discussed in the most secure rooms across the world. This is a story built on fragments, signals, movements, and silence. And it is that silence that is perhaps the most concerning element. Because when powerful nations choose not to speak, it often suggests that something has already occurred, something that cannot easily be reversed, and something that is still unfolding behind layers of control and secrecy. In the early hours before sunrise, multiple surveillance systems detected coordinated activity across regions that rarely align with such precision. Satellite imagery revealed convoy movements carefully shielded by electronic countermeasures. Communications were limited, tightly controlled, and intentionally obscured. At first, analysts attempted to classify the activity within known operational patterns, but it quickly became clear that this situation did not match anything previously documented. Instead, it pointed towards something new, something deliberately designed to avoid recognition. As more data began to emerge, one detail stood out above the rest. The direction of movement led toward a region already known for its strategic importance, Tehran. Beneath its surface, within restricted zones and reinforced underground facilities, unusual activity began to take shape. Access points were secured, internal movements increased, digital traffic surged within encrypted networks, effectively isolating the operation from external observation. These were not random developments. They followed structure, precision, and intent. Israeli intelligence, closely monitoring the region, intercepted fragmented transmissions. Words like integration, final stage, and readiness appeared across partial decodes. While incomplete, the repetition of these terms raised immediate concern. Emergency discussions were initiated behind closed doors. The question was no longer whether something was happening, but rather what exactly was being prepared and how far along it had progressed. In Washington, briefings began before sunrise. Intelligence officials presented a scenario built not on direct confirmation, but on convergence, multiple independent sources pointing toward the same conclusion. A possible strategic shift involving advanced capability. The language used in these briefings remained careful and measured, avoiding definitive statements while still conveying urgency. As the day progressed, official silence became the dominant response. No confirmations, no denials, only statements emphasizing monitoring and assessment. A pattern often used when information is incomplete or when revealing too much could compromise ongoing operations. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, strategic preparations quietly intensified. Defense systems were reviewed, contingency scenarios mapped, intelligence assets redirected toward one primary objective: clarity. Yet clarity remained elusive. Each new signal introduced more variables. Heat signatures fluctuated without pattern, and communication bursts appeared briefly before vanishing again. This suggested something critical. Whatever operation was underway had been designed with counter-observation as a core element. It was not just hidden, it was built to remain hidden. Deep within restricted facilities, activity continued with precision. Technicians followed structured protocols. Equipment was positioned, systems calibrated. And as time passed, it became increasingly clear this was not an emerging situation. It was the execution of a plan that had been in development long before it was ever detected. Back-channel communications between global powers began to increase. Messages exchanged through secure and indirect lines attempted to reduce uncertainty without triggering escalation. Yet responses remained incomplete, delayed, carefully worded, creating a communication gap that only amplified tension. Analysts began to consider a more complex possibility: that this operation was not intended for immediate action, but for strategic positioning, a shift in balance without crossing visible thresholds. New signals soon emerged, brief encrypted transmissions consistent with system testing or integration phases. Their content remained unclear, but their timing suggested progression. Strategic discussions intensified. Options were evaluated, each carrying risk and dependent on incomplete information. As the second phase approached, the atmosphere shifted from analysis to anticipation. Patterns began to align, timelines converged, and the window for influencing outcomes appeared to narrow. Yet still, silence continued, no announcements, no visible escalation. Inside decision-making rooms, pressure reached extreme levels. Intelligence updates arrived more frequently, each containing fragments but never the full picture. Analysts cross-reference satellite data with signals intelligence, searching for patterns. But instead of simplification, the situation grew more complex. Deep within Tehran, activity entered a new phase. Movements became more controlled and precise. Fewer personnel were involved, indicating the operation had moved beyond assembly. This was now integration, the stage where systems are tested and prepared for activation. Monitoring teams detected another series of transmissions. Short, highly encrypted, appearing and disappearing within seconds. But this time, something had changed. The interval between transmissions had shortened. This subtle detail suggested acceleration. Global communication channels reflected rising tension. Leaders spoke carefully. Public statements emphasized stability, but behind those words, calculations continued. Risk assessments were updated. Contingency plans refined. Financial indicators began to shift as well. Energy markets showed early volatility. Defense sectors experienced subtle movement. These shifts were not reactions to confirmed events but to expectations. Independent analysts proposed multiple theories, none of which could be fully verified. As the day moved toward its final hours, patterns converged. Timelines tightened. The window for influence appeared to be closing. A sense of inevitability began to take hold, not because the outcome was known but because the trajectory suggested it had moved beyond early intervention. As night approached, final data updates were compiled. The report did not offer confirmation, but it did offer convergence. Multiple independent indicators pointing toward the same conclusion that a system of strategic significance had likely reached near operational readiness. In Tel Aviv, urgency remained but was now paired with caution. Military systems stayed active, but action was held back. In Washington, discussions shifted toward managing outcomes rather than preventing events. The assumption had begun to change from possibility to probability. Deep beneath restricted zones, the system remained silent, fully integrated, fully shielded, nearly impossible to verify. But this invisibility was not a weakness, it was an advantage. Global leaders continued to communicate carefully. Financial systems quietly reflected the shift. Analysts compiled their final assessments again, not confirmation, but convergence. A strategic capability of unknown specification had likely reached operational status. This did not trigger immediate action. Instead, it triggered recalibration. A shift in expectations. In Tel Aviv, a final internal deadline passed without action. Maintain readiness but avoid escalation. In Washington, a similar conclusion emerged, not through a directive but through alignment, the understanding that flexibility must be preserved, that in a landscape defined by uncertainty, rigid decisions can become dangerous. As global attention shifted elsewhere, the situation did not disappear. It evolved into a background reality quietly, influencing decisions. This transformation itself was significant because it demonstrated something important, that major strategic shifts no longer require visible events. They can happen silently, gradually, almost invisibly. And that brings us to the most important takeaway. Power today is not always demonstrated through action. It is often defined by capability, positioning, and the ability to operate beyond detection. So as we move forward, one question remains: what happens next? In a world where the most important developments are the ones we cannot fully see,